I just have some thoughts that were sort of generated by Mary's paper, and I think there's a lot of things in that paper that we could extend out. And I'm going to try to take a stab at a few of those. But the subject matter of the symposium here makes me think of, especially as it relates to university education and secular university education, at least in the U.S., calls to mind something that Calvin College philosopher Jamie Smith said a few years back on Twitter. Sorry. And he said this: when someone tells me they are a free thinker, I know pretty much everything that they believe. And the point is, of course, that we don't, as far as I can tell, we don't use the term free thinker anymore. Probably progressive is sort of taken the place of that in some ways. But it reveals a problem for the epistemic status of the views that people have, I think. And so today, in general terms, I'm thinking of the humanities and social sciences, especially at most secular universities. There's an attempt to produce people of the same political persuasions and passions that were associated with freethinkers in the past. Unfortunately, many of the political and moral beliefs undergirding such an education are not really put to the test in the classroom, as far as I can tell. And so it's sort of a couple of stories. As I read Dr. Poplin's paper, two incidents came to mind that reflect much of this. And it reflects the lack of critical analysis related to these beliefs. 2 years ago, one of my students, a young Catholic woman who was very involved with the pro-life student group on campus, shared an experience with me that she had had with another professor. She was walking into class from one of the parking lots, and she knew the other professor because she was the head of the Women and Gender Studies department, and so there was a lot of conflict on campus between these two groups, as you can imagine. But as my student was walking, the professor was talking on her cell phone behind her. And as they walked, my student heard the professor mocking her and the pro-life buttons on her backpack. And for me, this reveals several problems. And I'm not a culture warrior, so I'm not trying to grind an axe about that. I mean, I think there's important problems in the culture that need to be resolved, obviously. But for me, it revealed several things that I think are kind of indicative of what the university is like. I think this shows a moral failure on the part of the professor. Of course, we all have those, but at any rate, this one's a little more acceptable these days, I think. Whatever one's definition of a good professor and a good person, it should be clear that mocking a student for their political and religious beliefs in such a manner is unacceptable. And I'll just say, it's parenthetically, those things are best done, right, with a cynical attitude and a knowing smile in your office with other faculty. Okay, so. I did have a little fun writing this, but all right. Second, it reveals the hegemonic status not only of secularism, but of a certain secular, and I'll use Dallas kind of scare quotes, progressive understanding of morality, because I actually think progressive, and what it really means, should mean making progress towards the truth. And while I think there's some good elements of sort of secular progressivism in certain realms, yes, some, JP. He's shaking his head at me. There are some deep problems as well. Their understanding, especially of morality, politics, and social change. Third, it reveals the hypocrisy often present in the contemporary university. Even though I teach at a school that's sort of the top edge of the Bible Belt, I still don't think things would go well for me, right, if I was mocking an atheist or pro-choice student for the buttons on their backpack. I'd probably end up in an office somewhere, and I would say rightfully so, but okay. But what's good for the goose is good for the gander. The second incident comes to mind happened even several years before that, and there's a point to this, by the way, so just trust me. A professor on my campus challenged our university's decision to offer health benefits to the same-sex partners of employees at our university. So Kentucky kind of runs a little bit behind every place else. But more to the point today, or what I'm talking about today, is that he challenged the prevailing progressive beliefs about sexuality from a conservative Roman Catholic, both theological and philosophical point of view in the university student newspaper. So you can imagine the response. There are several letters from almost every member of the psychology department on campus that challenged his claims about same-sex relationships and human flourishing in their letters to the editor in the paper. But the way they did it was to simply note that the American Psychological Association no longer sees any problems with those orientations or behaviors, and that they don't hinder human flourishing at all. And that was it, right? So the appeal to authority was thought to settle the issue. Now, granted, it's letters to the editor, but it worked, right? As far as I can tell. More than this, though, one psychology professor also cited a study in his letter to the editor that purported to show that those who vocally oppose homosexuality in some way are themselves likely latent homosexuals, and he implied that this was the case with my Catholic colleague. So I defended my colleague in the newspaper, pointing out the flaws in the reasoning and the attacks. As a coincidence, I was talking to my honors students about informal fallacies. So I took all the letters on both sides. And there, as you can imagine, they were rife with fallacies. We had a great discussion about that. But I share these stories simply to underscore what we already know. The university, as we know it, is in trouble. It's no longer a university, right? It's not a university. It's not united. And if it is united, it's around some things that are troubling. The understanding of who counts as a good person is pretty thin. In many ways, the university is no longer a marketplace of ideas, but a platform for some to work for social change. So certain programs on my campus talk about their graduates as change agents, which I don't have a problem with in a certain sense, but there's a program going on, right? The aim is to get people to go out and do what we want them to do politically and socially. And so I'm still trying to work through the pros and cons of that, because that's sort of what is done here, right, with the philosophy program, to go out and make the Christian message plausible. But there's something different, right? Here there was this open pursuit of the truth. All questions were up for grabs. It didn't matter, right? We would engage about that. There's not that same openness to dialogue and debate, as far as I can tell, among some of these, in some segments at the university. Okay, so this is done. This idea of social change is often done at the expense of a quality education. It's not isolated to the ivory towers, of course. It flows from there to everywhere else. So here are some thoughts about restoring moral knowledge, and then I'll stop. I fully agree with the two suggestions in the paper about ways we can help restore it, right? Of course, we want to offer a Christian account of the good person, and we need to be more active as public intellectuals, reaching beyond the university to foster discussion and knowledge related to the kinds of questions that Dallas Willard asked and encouraged us to ask. Is reality secular? Who is a good person? What's required for human flourishing? And this comes from the paper. I don't think it was mentioned here, but Mary mentioned about a reticence to engage like our more dogmatic opponents, right? Those that are committed antagonists, right? To be part of an open dialogue with them. And so I understand that, right? You don't want to beat your head against a wall unnecessarily. But over the past few years, some of the thoughts I've had is that when we do engage people who are really entrenched in a certain view that runs counter to ours, often the value of that is not really for them, it's for the people that are on the sidelines watching, right? So it could be for other Christians or Christian students. So even though some of these people might be intransigent in their recalcitrance, I like that phrase too, but those who listen and observe might benefit. Fellow believers on campus and in the community could be edified and encouraged, see their faith strengthened. I think that this can help those who might be at least open to the possibility of moral knowledge, right? That when we can engage even with the committed antagonist, so to speak, show what is wrong with what they believe and make the case for our own views about moral knowledge, the antagonist may not benefit, but others may. And then related to this, I think our secular colleagues have some access to moral knowledge that is ultimately grounded in the character of God, though perhaps that access or that knowledge is indirect in a certain sense. This is something we need to make use of as we do our work. We can find common ground insofar as there is knowledge about morality, human selves, human flourishing that's available outside of special revelation. So let me skip this and give you some examples. Well, I'll stand up for Plato again. I think we can translate moral knowledge that's present ultimately grounded in God's character through philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, for example. And so in a way that my students don't really care about the forms and the good, and when I talk about the ideal couch, they're not too interested. But when I just talk about Plato's picture of the good life, a life of wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice, and then I say, part of Plato's case is we'll just look at this kind of life. Isn't this just desirable? Like, And so the analogy Plato uses, if I recall right, I teach it, so I hope I'm right. Right, if you saw someone who gave you a choice, maybe this is just a thought experiment that I saw somewhere, between like a genie. You can have a life of physical health and flourishing, die in your sleep at 90, happy and fulfilled, or a life where, at 20 you get in a bad wreck, you have chronic pain, then you have cancer at 30, then another terminal disease, and you die at 40 after 5 years of long suffering. Which life would you choose? Well, of course they look at me like, what is it, am I paying for this? Well, not enough. But of course it's the healthy life. And so the point is, Plato's picture of the life of virtue, well, of course it's incomplete. Can't you just see that this is a better life? And what would you really choose? A life of foolishness, intemperance, cowardice, and injustice? And that taps into something. And I would argue it taps into the image of God that's still there. And then I think we can go on from there to Aquinas, discuss the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. We can talk about Aristotle's views concerning moral development, that you just have to kind of work hard at it. But then you can tap into that experience of, you try hard. Have you had the experience where you really wanted to do something you thought was right and you just couldn't? Or you can't stop being a jerk to your little sister or your parents or whatever. And then it's like, and then you bring in Aquinas, right? The Christian view is that we can't do it, right? We need God's not just forgiveness, but assistance and grace, those kinds of things, if we're going to become the good people that we're meant to be. Okay, I'll just sum up here because I think I'm going a little long. I think there's a lot of stuff we can do empirically. So this goes back to some of the things that have happened with positive psychology. So think about the fact that empirical knowledge can be useful for particular questions, both in moral philosophy and moral theology. And so I think the plausibility of philosophical and theological accounts of character traits and their connections to human flourishing can be enhanced or undermined by empirical data, but that's because the subject matter is not merely conceptual. The application of those accounts to the everyday lives of human beings will have empirical elements. And so that data can decrease or increase our justification for the claims included. So for an example, in some of my work on humility, I made use of empirical data that it's an important virtue for human flourishing. Humility plays a prominent role in what's called the one contemporary psychological model of personality structure, the Hexaco model, and partially because this honesty, humility dimension is present, that model has more explanatory power, at least according to some. Humility is also conducive to emotional well-being. It's empirically linked with pro-social traits and behaviors like gratitude, forgiveness, generosity, cooperation. And the fact that humility has these connections, fosters these virtues, is conducive to that kind of well-being, all counts in favor of its status as a virtue, regardless of what Hume, Nietzsche, and followers of Ayn Rand claim. So we need more of this kind of work on other Christian virtues like faith, hope, and love at the academic and popular levels. And so I thought of that because when you mentioned that, like, Christianity, right, that it view the family in these different ways that it leads to flourishing, you can actually test this way of life. And I'm not saying we just say, well, let's just go all empirical and just kind of give in, but it's like we maintain the fact and we stand next to and stand behind the philosophical, the theological, the spiritual knowledge, and then we add the empirical. We have to make use of the fact that our culture is more open to that. But if you can pry open the door to the fact that, yeah, maybe the virtuous life is the best life, and maybe it's a moral fact that humility is a virtue, or hope is a virtue, things like that, then people can begin to see moral reality. So a question and a conclusion. First, a question I think I just kind of wanted to throw out for discussion when I'm done is that you mentioned that one encouraging development is the character education that's happening across the country in schools. And so I just wonder about the current and future status of that, because my kids had that. And over the past few years, I've noticed when I ask my students in class how many of them had these character education programs, it seems to me the number's actually been declining the past 3 or 4 years. So I'm just curious if that's of course, it's just me asking students questions, so there's all sorts of flaws methodologically. But I'm just curious about what kind of data there is about that. Because I think, look, K through 12 is going to be the crucial time to help them develop character. And by the time they get to me, they've got a lot of habits as 18-year-olds, good and bad. Okay? finally, I guess I'd just like to say I enjoyed the paper very much, thought-provoking. I was challenged by the paper, I was encouraged by the paper, and I was actually motivated to go back and help my students, players, and the people in my life that I love get and live out the moral knowledge they need. So thank you for that.